Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Hilaal Live. Thanks for joining us on channel 347, also on our live stream, www.hilaal.tv. Today we're discussing a topic that everyone should actually move a bit closer to the TV and pay very close attention. We're chatting about wills, and because it's Wills Week, and very important on how and why we should have a will. And I thought, let's invite into studio an attorney who's been on the set before, Brother Whalied Said. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, to you as well as to all the viewers out there.
Jazakallah so much for affording me your time, coming in to chat, and I think our viewers would be most appreciative with regards to the information that we're going to discuss today.
Sure.
So Wills Week was introduced and implemented because there was a need. And,
Correct.
people saw that there were a lot more issues with people not having a will. So how did the introduction of Wills Week happen?
So Wills Week is something that was introduced by the Law Society of South Africa, and that was way back in 2008 already.
Okay.
So essentially what it encompasses is that attorneys register with the Law Society to take part in Wills Week.
Mm-hmm.
And what they do is they provide free services in terms of advising or drafting wills for people during Wills Week.
Okay, brilliant. And obviously there was a need for this because, not having a will and obviously passing away has dire circumstances, and which we're going to expand on a bit later.
Absolutely. We'll touch on that in more detail later, but there are consequences for not directing things the way you intend or would like it to happen.
Yeah. So let's chat about, Muslims and having Sharia compliant wills. Take us through some of the parameters that one needs to keep in mind.
Okay, so besides the legal requirement for having a will, which is important, it's very important, obviously, to also have a Sharia compliant will.
Okay.
Now, as Muslims, we are obviously guided by the Holy Quran.
Mm-hmm.
Now, to give an idea as to the importance this holds within the Quran, I'm going to use an analogy. And something that we all are very familiar with, and that is the practice of salah.
Okay.
Right? We know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran in various ayat that we need to make salah.
Mm-hmm.
But nowhere in the Quran does Allah actually tell us how to make salah.
Mm-hmm.
That privilege He left to our beloved Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam to teach us the intricacies of how to make salah. However, when it comes to the subject of inheritance,
mm-hmm.
not only does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran direct us in Surah Baqarah verse 180 that we need to have a will, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala goes further in Surah An-Nisa, where He actually directs how our estates need to be wound up.
Mm-hmm.
And those verses, for example, is where we get the common or well-known principles from, a boy gets 2 shares and a girl gets 1 share.
Mm-hmm.
Those come from Surah An-Nisa. Right? So that should tell us the importance of having a Sharia compliant will, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took it upon Himself to detail those issues in the Quran itself.
Right.
The in-depth understanding of it was bestowed on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that we learn through Sunnah. But the very basics of it is directly dealt with in the Quran by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
So when we're drawing up a will, we often refer to Dr. Google for everything. I mean, most times, a do-it-yourself will pop up on how you can draft and, the ins and outs. But does one need to consult an attorney when drawing up a will?
I think it's critical because it's so easy to make a simple mistake that can invalidate a will.
Okay.
And we often find that even with business contracts, people do contracts between themselves, and it's fine until there's a problem.
Right.
So when you end up going to the lawyer, then it's too late because you've already signed it as it is. In this case, however, if there's a problem, there's nothing you can do about it because you would have been deceased.
Mm-hmm.
And now your children or your heirs are sitting with a problem of an invalid will or a portion of an invalid will that cannot be properly used.
Right. Okay. I know there's an alarming stats with regards to a lot of people in South Africa that die without a will. What are those stats?
So those stats, if you go and Google, as you said earlier, you'll find the stat is something in the region of about 7 out of every 10 people die without a will.
As much as that.
As much as that. Granted, often people don't have assets and wouldn't necessarily need a will.
Right.
But from an Islamic perspective, the Quran is pretty clear. If you have something, if you have anything that represents wealth, even if it's a phone, you need to have a will to indicate what needs to happen to that asset or that wealth.
Do you find that over the years, we've now got the Divorce Amendment Act that's come into play, which then affects the Muslim Marriages Bill as well. That's all now has to be considered when drawing up a will, but especially through divorce as well. All these factors need to be put into place?
Well, if your will is correctly drafted, and if you follow the basic principles of Sharia, you shouldn't really have a problem. But you correctly point out that if you've outlined in your will that my wife must get X, and you've become divorced, then you need to actually update your will.
Correct.
And you need to make sure that in updating it, it's updated correctly so that you don't affect any of the other heirs or any of the assets in any particular way.
What are some of the common mistakes that you find that people tend to leave out when drawing up a Sharia compliant will, or maybe don't have all the relevant information when drawing up a will?
Okay, when drawing up a will in general, I think one of the biggest errors or mistakes people make is they don't sign it properly. Now I'm talking about DIY wills,
right,
or signing it with someone that knows a little bit but not enough, right? So, and I had this problem last week. Someone brought a will, the person's deceased, but the first page that has the identification on identifies the person, appoints the executor. That page wasn't signed. It's invalid. You can't use it because you could practically put any page there and say this is the will.
Right.
There's the signature on the second page.
Yeah.
So that's a common problem. Another problem that we experience is that sometimes people appoint someone as an executor, but they don't waive the requirement for security. So if you are not a parent or a spouse or a dependent, a child, then those people are exempt from providing security. Anybody else, if you're appointing your brother or your cousin or your friend, they have to provide security to the full value of your estate. So if you're sitting with an estate that's worth 1 million, 2 million, 3 million rand, that person needs to provide security. If they can't provide security, they can't be the executor. So now you've appointed someone without waiving security, but they can't actually act because they don't have the capacity to put up 2 million rands worth of security.
Gotcha. What are the maybe important things to consider when you don't have a will? I mean, it's often enough I've heard that estates have taken forever to be wound up because there's no will present. Do you find that as well?
I think it's less of an issue of there being no will present. I mean, there's multiple factors that can actually affect how long an estate takes to wind up, right? Not having a will is simply one of those factors, but it's the starting factor.
Okay.
And if you don't get out of the starting blocks, everything else just takes that much longer.
Right.
Yeah.
You spoke about executor. Take us through what is needed by appointing an executor on a will. Take us through the parameters.
Okay. I think one of the most important issues there is that it must be someone competent, firstly. It must be someone that you trust will give effect to your wishes. So, typical example there is you appoint someone, but they don't really care about Sharia compliance, even though your will says Sharia compliance. No, you take that, it's fine, it doesn't matter. No, it actually does matter.
Right.
Because every little item has a value attached to it, and that value needs to be taken into account when we're dealing with Sharia. Because when you're giving me 5 cents that I'm not supposed to get, that money is haram for me.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's where your executor plays an incredibly important role.
And what are the other duties, some of the other duties of an executor?
So the executor's duty is to obviously ascertain at the time of the death who is the heirs of the deceased.
Okay.
What are the assets? What are the liabilities? So there's a bit of investigation that needs to happen. Once all of those are determined, there's a range of paperwork that needs to be completed, needs to be submitted to the master. Then you have to one of the documents that you need to do is called the liquidation and distribution account.
Yes.
That's basically an outline of all the assets, all the liabilities, any income, expenses, how the estate will be distributed. That account has to be advertised in one of the local newspapers as well as the government gazette, for the purposes of people being able to see it, and anyone being able to object to it, to say, sorry, I actually have a claim against this estate, so you can't distribute it like that because I wasn't paid my 10,000 Rand or whatever it is.
Gotcha. All right. We're going to continue with this after the break, because, this is a very integral and very important role that an executor plays when drawing up a will. And just to, for our audience to know the parameters. We're in studio with Brother Whalied Said, who is an attorney based in Cape Town, chatting about Wills Week and the importance of having a will. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we will continue with Hilaal Live. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Hilaal Live. Thanks for watching us on channel 347. Remember, you can also download our apps. We're on all the good app stores as well. Today we're discussing wills, and especially being Wills Week, how important and imperative it is to have a will. And in studio, we've invited Brother Whalied Said, who's an attorney in the Western Cape. Brother Whalied, jazakallah so much for coming in once again,
Pleasure.
educating us around this very, very important topic. Before the break, we chatted about the executor and the role that an executor plays when it comes to drawing up a will. We just want to reiterate those points very quickly before we move on to other roles an executor has to play.
Okay. So essentially, the executor's responsibility is to ensure that the estate is lodged with the master. In doing so, he or she is obliged to ascertain what are the assets and liabilities of the deceased, who are the heirs of the deceased, lodge the necessary documents with the master of the High Court. There's some advertising that needs to take place. There's a liquidation and distribution account that needs to be filed that outlines the entire estate and what inheritances will be given to whichever heirs, and so on. And only once that account has been approved by the master, it has lain open for inspection, free of objection, then distribution can take place of the estate.
It's quite a tedious process.
Correct.
And, if one of those steps are missing, it can halt the estate being wound up. A lot of work as well for an executor, and you mentioned it's always somebody that you would trust, and ensure that your obligations are, they fulfill their obligations with regards to the will. But is there a fee attached to all of this? For example, if I appoint somebody that's part of my family, do I need to pay them a fee once all of this is done?
Okay, so how the fees work in winding up of estates? The fee for winding up an estate is legislated at 3.5% of the gross asset value of the estate.
Okay.
So that is the fee that your executor is entitled to charge. So if it's your mom or your dad that has passed away, you have an election to not charge that fee because it's your mom or your dad.
Gotcha.
The problem,
so a beneficiary can be an executor as well?
A beneficiary can be an executor. An heir can be
an heir
can be an executor as well. The problem comes in that the process is often so tedious that most people don't have the time and energy to do what needs to be done in order to get the process going. So inevitably they appoint an agent, and what we find nowadays, and especially in the last 2 or 3 years, is that the master has insisted that there must be an agent that's an attorney or a company that does estate administration, because dealing with members of the public it's just too tedious, because
it can be long-winded.
Because they lack the necessary understanding of process. Even a simple thing as how to place an ad with the government gazette, it's not that easy. The fact that we do it every other day it's kind of nothing.
Of course.
That said, the process itself still involves a lot of red tape. There's still a lot of manual processes that we need to go through. You won't believe it, but the master of the High Court this year only went on to an online system where you can submit. I mean, after all the time that we've been online, with other processes, for example, this is the first year, a couple of months ago, that the masters actually went online in terms of being able to submit an estate.
We often hear there's a massive backlog at the masters as well. And I would imagine that COVID must have exacerbated that situation. Have they caught up? I mean, where are we with that?
Yeah, I mean, COVID had a big impact, but there were problems before COVID.
Yeah.
COVID just exacerbated those problems, and they haven't caught up, sadly. And it's not just a problem with the Master of the High Court Cape Town. You find the same problems in Joburg,
Gotcha.
KZN. Some offices operate better than others, as you would find in any other environment. But generally, it's bad.
Yeah.
That said, there are good people within the Master's office, and there are situations where we submit an estate and we get a response within 2 to 3 weeks. But then there are estates where the files just go missing, and 2 years later they still can't find it. I've got 1 or 2 estates where I'm waiting 2 years for letters, and despite the fact that my clerks go there every single week to do inquiries and follow up,
still nothing.
Still nothing.
Wow. We're chatting about Wills Week, and if you have any questions, we're going to bring up the WhatsApp number a bit later. You're welcome to send through a question, a concern, a query if you have, and we'll pass that on to Brother Whalied as well. Well, the other component that I was very interested in, when we chat about the material components of a will, what should we keep in mind?
I think the first important thing is that the testator or the person drafting the will must be clearly identified. And it's important to always ensure that the name that you're writing on the will is the same as in your identity document. Now, often, and this is more common with our older folk as opposed to sort of the current generation, there were always problems with home affairs. So if you came there and, you know, my child's name was Muhammad, they would register him as Hamad. And everybody would still refer to him as Muhammad. But when you look at the ID document, which most people don't, there's actually a different name or a different spelling.
Gotcha.
And that often causes problems, because you'll find that the spelling on the title deed versus the spelling on the ID versus the spelling on every other document is all different. And that causes complications. So that's the first thing. The second thing is appointing a credible and trustworthy executor.
Right.
The next thing is the issue of making sure that your debts are provided for, that debts must be paid first. The next thing is the opportunity to give a charity.
Okay.
One of the important considerations, especially from a Sharia compliant will, not a compliant will, but from a Sharia perspective, is that from Hadith we know that one of the 3 things that benefit us after our death is the Sadaqatul Jariyah. And this is your final opportunity to give a Sadaqatul Jariyah to put into your will. So think about that, make provision for that. And then obviously indicating that your estate must be wound up in terms of the rules of Sharia.
Brilliant. Very good advice. There are times where we find that the person drawing up a will may unfortunately be very ill to actually sign the will or go into an attorney or chat with an executor of the will. What happens in those situations? Do we cater for situations like that?
Yes, for sure. I've done it on a number of occasions where we receive calls to say this person can't come out. They're either in a hospital bed or they're bedridden at home. And we actually go out to them to do their will. If a person cannot sign, whether they're bedridden or ill, maybe some disability or something, if they cannot sign, they are only required to make a mark.
Okay.
But an attorney must witness that mark, and we have to provide a certificate which is then attached to the will.
Gotcha.
To verify that the mark on the will is the mark of the testator. Yeah.
Any closing advice? Because I'm sure our viewers have so many questions with regards to wills, because we often hear there are times where people have a bit of issues, challenges when it comes to wills. But what's your closing advice?
I think at this point in time, the first piece of advice that I'm going to give is, it's Wills Week. There's attorneys all over the country that is offering free services in respect of wills. Take advantage of it. Make an appointment. Go and consult an attorney, even if it's just to check if your current will is sufficient and compliant. If you don't have a will, make an appointment and get yourself a will.
Okay.
That's
And very important, make sure all the details are correct.
All the details are correct, yeah.
Are there details for yourself that you would like to give up? If somebody wants to get hold of you, what's the best methods to do that?
The best method, email, telephone. So our telephone number at the office is 021 823-7862, or they can email us on estates@sayyidattorneys.co.za. And if they can't remember any of these or don't have a pen handy, they can always just Google Sayyid Attorneys, that's SAID, Century City, and they'll find our details online.
Brilliant. Well, I'm sure you're in for a busy week. It's not just people drawing up new wills, but updating your will as well, your current will.
Correct.
How often would one do that? I mean,
look, it depends. You know, there's two different ways of drafting wills. One of my preferred methods is, I call it the basic Sharia compliant will when dealing with Sharia wills, is that you don't actually name and list your assets, but you leave that in the hands of the executor.
Okay.
So when your assets change, you change your car all the time, you change your phone all the time. Sometimes we move house. You don't need to update your will if you haven't specified those items in your will. Right? If you have, however, specified those items in your will, then it's obviously important that you review your will regularly. So if you know you're busy moving, make sure that you also provide for the fact that you need to update your will.
Right. Okay, brilliant. Brother Whalied, Jazakallah so much once again. I'm sure our viewers will get hold of you. And thank you for being somebody that can explain all of this and make it a lot easier, because sometimes it can be a bit challenging as well.
It can be, but that's what we're there for, and that's what this program is there for as well.
Jazakallah so much. Have a great evening. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
There we go. That's how we end Hilaal Live. We're back tomorrow, inshallah. From the Cape Town team, Sohail Barnes, Mohammed Parker, and myself, Luqman Shadrack. Have a great evening. Assalamu alaikum.